The complete story of Saint Jude Thaddeus, apostle of the impossible. In the shadowed corners of first-century Palestine, a man walked among the crowds, following an itinerant preacher from Nazareth. His name was Judas, a name that would become both blessed and cursed, remembered and forgotten, whispered in desperate prayer, and lost in historical confusion. History would know him by many names: Jude, Thaddeus, Lebbaeus, Judas, not Iscariot. But 2,000 years later, millions would know him as the saint of impossible causes, the patron of desperate situations, the apostle you turn to when all other hope has fled. Yet who was this man really? How did an obscure apostle, mentioned only briefly in Scripture, become one of Christianity's most beloved intercessors? Why do people facing terminal illness, financial ruin, legal impossibilities, and crushing despair light candles and whisper prayers to Saint Jude? This is not a story about philosophy or theology in the systematic sense. This is something more immediate, more human, more mysterious. It's a story about how a nearly forgotten follower of Jesus became the embodiment of hope itself, how silence and obscurity transformed into one of the most powerful devotions in Christian history, how the saint nobody knew became the saint everyone needs. If you're finding value in these stories, I'd be grateful if you could tap that like button or subscribe. It genuinely makes a bigger difference than you'd think. I'm always fascinated to know where you're listening from, so leave a comment with your city and what time it is there right now. There's something beautiful about our little community connecting across time zones through these late-night stories. Now, get settled. Maybe dim those lights, turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore why a man history nearly forgot became the saint that millions remember in their darkest hours, and why his story might be more relevant today than ever before. Part 1. The man behind the names. Who was Jude Thaddeus? The question is more complicated than it seems, tangled in ancient manuscripts, confused identities, and the challenge of separating historical fact from centuries of pious legend. Even his name presents a puzzle that scholars have debated for 2,000 years. The New Testament refers to him variously as Judas, Jude, Thaddeus, and Lebbaeus. Different gospel writers use different names. Ancient manuscripts show variations. Early church fathers disagreed about whether these names referred to one person or several. This confusion wasn't accidental. It was deliberate, born from the shadow cast by another Judas, the betrayer. In the Gospels, we find him listed among the 12 apostles, but always with a qualifier. Matthew's Gospel calls him Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus. Mark simply calls him Thaddeus. Luke and Acts call him Judas the son of James, or Judas not Iscariot. John's Gospel gives us the only recorded words of Jude in Scripture, and even there, he's introduced with a clarification. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him. The parenthetical phrase reveals everything. By the time these Gospels were written, the name Judas had become synonymous with betrayal. Any other Judas needed immediate disambiguation. This man's entire historical identity was shaped by being not the other one. So who was he really? The most reliable historical reconstruction suggests he was born in the early years of the 1st century, likely in Galilee, that turbulent northern region of Palestine where Jesus himself grew up. The name Judas was common among Jews of this period. It meant praised and carried echoes of Judah, the patriarch and the kingdom. Thaddeus may have been a nickname meaning heart or courageous, while Lebbeus might have meant heart as well, or possibly derived from Levi. These multiple names weren't unusual in a culture where people were often known by various identifiers depending on context and community. Early Christian tradition, particularly in the East, identified Jude as the brother of James the Less, which would make him a relative of Jesus himself. This identification comes from comparing the lists of apostles with mentions of Jesus' brothers in the Gospels. Matthew and Mark both mention Jesus' brothers. Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? If this Judas is our Jude, then he was either Jesus' blood brother, half-brother, cousin, or more distant relative, depending on how one interprets brother in the context of first-century Jewish family structure. This familial connection would be profoundly significant. It means Jude would have grown up knowing Jesus, perhaps playing with him as a child, working alongside him, eating meals together, hearing Mary and Joseph's stories about Jesus' birth. It means that when Jesus began his public ministry, claiming to be the Messiah, performing miracles, teaching with unprecedented authority, Jude wasn't a stranger who decided to follow. He was family facing an impossible decision. Believe your brother is the Son of God, or think he's lost his mind. The Gospels hint at this family tension. Mark records that Jesus' relatives thought he was out of his mind and tried to restrain him. John's Gospel notes that not even his brothers believed in him during Jesus' ministry. If Jude was among these skeptical brothers, then his journey to apostleship was a journey from doubt to faith, from embarrassment to devotion, from seeing Jesus as a problematic relative to recognizing him as Lord. This transformation would have been wrenching, personal, intimate, in ways that the other apostles' conversions were not. What was Jude like as a person? Here we're reduced to speculation, but we can paint a plausible portrait from the fragments we have. He was likely a working-class Galilean, probably a fisherman or laborer given the social context. Galilee was a volatile region, seething with political resentment against Roman occupation, breeding ground for zealots and revolutionaries. Growing up there meant living with poverty, oppression, taxation, and the constant threat of Roman violence. It shaped a particular kind of character, resilient, stubborn, accustomed to hardship, prone to apocalyptic hopes for divine intervention. The Galilean accent was distinctive, rougher, and more provincial than the cultivated speech of Jerusalem. It marked you as a country person, uneducated, low status. This is the accent Peter was identified by in the courtyard during Jesus' trial. Jude would have spoken with the same accent, been marked by the same social stigma. He was not a scholar, not a priest, not a scribe. He was ordinary, one of the people the Jewish elite dismissed as people of the land who didn't know the law. Yet Jesus chose him as one of the 12. This choice is itself significant. Jesus didn't choose his apostles from the educated classes, the religiously trained, the socially prominent. He chose fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, people from the margins. The 12 were not obviously qualified for their task of spreading a new religion throughout the Roman Empire. They were qualified only by their encounter with Jesus, by his call, by the transformation he worked in them. What did that transformation look like for Jude? The one glimpse we get comes from John's Gospel at the Last Supper. Jesus has just told the disciples, that he will manifest himself to them, but not to the world. And Jude asks, Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world? It's a question that reveals much. It shows concern with how Jesus' mission will succeed if he remains hidden. It shows someone thinking practically, wondering about strategy and method. It shows, perhaps, a desire for Jesus to reveal himself publicly, triumphantly, unmistakably, the natural hope of someone who's given up everything to follow a leader. Jesus' answer is characteristically indirect. If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. He doesn't explain the strategy. He shifts from public manifestation to intimate indwelling, from spectacular revelation to quiet love. Whether Jude understood this answer in that moment, we don't know. The Gospels record nothing more from him. He disappears back into the collective anonymity of the 12, mentioned in lists, but given no individual stories, no distinctive actions, no recorded words beyond that single question. This obscurity is itself part of Jude's identity. While Peter and John and James dominate the gospel narratives, while we know their personalities and follow their stories, Jude remains in the shadows. He was there for everything: the teachings, the miracles, the Last Supper, crucifixion, the resurrection appearances, Pentecost. But he's never the focus. He's always part of the group, never the individual. This pattern of being present but unnoticed, significant but overlooked, would characterize not just his life, but his entire legacy. The other crucial text associated with Jude is the Epistle of Jude, a brief letter in the New Testament. The letter identifies its author as Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. If this is our Jude, it's the only substantial writing we have from him. But even this attribution is contested. Some scholars accept it as authentic, written by the apostle in the 60s or 70s AD. Others see it as pseudonymous, written by a later follower using Jude's name for authority. The debate hinges on language, theology, historical references, and assumptions about literacy among Galilean apostles. The letter itself is fascinating, fierce, urgent, uncompromising. It warns against false teachers who have infiltrated the church, libertines who are perverting grace into license for immorality. The rhetoric is vivid and harsh. These false teachers are waterless clouds carried along by winds, fruitless trees in late autumn, twice dead, uprooted, wild waves of the sea, casting up the foam of their own shame, wandering stars, for whom the gloom of utter darkness has been reserved forever. This is not gentle pastoral guidance. This is prophetic denunciation. What's particularly striking is Jude's use of extra-biblical Jewish texts. He quotes from the Book of Enoch, a Jewish apocalyptic work not included in the biblical canon, treating it as authoritative scripture. He references a story about Michael the archangel disputing with the devil over Moses' body, a legend found in Jewish tradition, but not in the Old Testament. This shows someone deeply immersed in Second Temple Judaism, familiar with its apocalyptic literature, comfortable citing texts that would later be excluded from the Protestant Bible. The letter's concern is preserving apostolic teaching against innovation and corruption. Jude appeals to the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints, suggesting a body of established teaching that must be defended. He urges his readers to contend for the faith, to build themselves up in their holy faith, to keep themselves in the love of God. The tone is defensive, protective, concerned with boundaries and purity. Whether these concerns reflect Jude's actual personality or a later writer's attribution, they became part of how Jude was understood as a guardian of orthodoxy, a defender of true teaching. But again, we must acknowledge how little we actually know. Did Jude write this letter? We can't be certain. Did he say anything else? Do anything else? Teach anything distinctive? If he did, it wasn't recorded. His voice, his personality, his individual contribution to early Christianity remains largely hidden. And this hiddenness, this obscurity, would paradoxically become central to his later significance. The saint nobody knew became the saint who understands being overlooked, forgotten, dismissed. The apostle with no story became the saint for situations with no apparent solution. Part 2. The Silent Years and Lost Missions. After Pentecost, after the descent of the Holy Spirit transformed the frightened disciples into bold apostles, the 12 scattered. They had received their commission: go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. But where exactly did each one go? For most of the apostles, we have only fragments, legends, traditions that may or may not reflect historical reality. For Jude, we have even less. The New Testament never mentions him again after Acts chapter 1, where he's listed among those waiting in Jerusalem for the promised Spirit. After that, silence. Complete, absolute silence in the canonical texts. This silence is deafening. It means that for the rest of Jude's life, probably 30 to 40 years of missionary activity, of preaching, of establishing churches, of enduring persecution, we have no reliable contemporary accounts. Everything that comes after is tradition, legend, hagiography, written centuries later by people who knew no more than we do, but filled the silence with pious stories. Yet these traditions, however historically questionable, reveal what communities of believers wanted to remember, what they needed Jude to be. The earliest post-biblical tradition associates Jude with mission work in Judea, Samaria, Galilee, and Syria. Eusebius, the 4th century church historian, mentions that after the death of James, Jesus' brother and leader of the Jerusalem church, someone named Simeon, son of Clopas and a cousin of Jesus, became the next bishop of Jerusalem. If Jude was part of this extended family of Jesus, he would have been connected to the Jerusalem church in its early years, witnessing its struggles with the Jewish authorities, its debates about whether Gentile converts needed to follow Jewish law, its eventual destruction when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 70 AD. But Jude apparently didn't stay in Jerusalem. Multiple traditions place him in broader missionary activity, though the accounts differ wildly in their details. One tradition says he preached in Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq. Another sends him to Armenia, that mountainous kingdom between the Black and Caspian Seas. Yet another tradition connects him with Persia. Some accounts have him working alone. Others pair him with the apostle Simon the Zealot, suggesting they were missionary partners who traveled and ministered together. The Armenian tradition is particularly strong and persistent. Armenian Christianity claims apostolic foundation by Jude and Bartholomew, and this claim is woven deeply into Armenian national identity. Armenian sources tell elaborate stories of Jude's mission to their land, his miracles, his confrontations with pagan priests, his establishment of Christian communities. Whether these stories preserve actual historical memory or represent later nationalistic claims to apostolic authority is impossible to determine. But they matter because they show how important Jude became to certain Christian communities, even if he remained obscure elsewhere. What would missionary work in these regions have entailed? We can extrapolate from what we know of early Christian mission and from Paul's better documented travels. It would have meant walking, endless walking, along dangerous roads through hostile territory. It would have meant entering cities and towns as a stranger, seeking out whoever would listen, probably beginning with Jewish communities and synagogues where there was shared religious vocabulary. It would have meant facing mockery, rejection, sometimes violence. It would have meant living in poverty, dependent on the hospitality of converts, vulnerable to exploitation and abandonment. The message Jude would have preached was the early Christian kerygma. Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, the Son of God. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, died, and was buried. On the third day, he rose from the dead. He appeared to many witnesses, including Jude himself. He ascended to heaven and will return to judge the living and the dead. All who believe in him will be saved. This was scandalous to Jews, who expected a triumphant Messiah, not a crucified one. It was foolishness to Greeks, who found the idea of bodily resurrection absurd. It was seditious to Romans, who permitted no king but Caesar. Preaching this message could get you killed. The Roman Empire tolerated many religions, but not those that refused to participate in civic cult, that rejected the divinity of the emperor, that claimed exclusive truth. Christianity's absolute claims and its refusal to accommodate other gods made it suspect, dangerous, eventually illegal. Christians faced sporadic local persecution from the beginning, and empire-wide persecution would come later. Apostles were marked men, hunted by both Jewish authorities, who saw them as heretics, and Roman authorities, who saw them as troublemakers. Yet the message spread. Against all odds, without institutional support, without wealth or power, without media or technology, Christianity grew. It grew through the testimony of witnesses like Jude, through the formation of small communities of believers, through the lived example of Christians who loved each other and cared for the poor and faced death with strange courage. It grew through miracles and spiritual experiences that convinced people the apostles' claims were true. It grew through something inexplicable, something believers called the Holy Spirit and skeptics called delusion or social contagion. What miracles did Jude perform? Later legends credit him with many: healings, exorcisms, raising the dead, prophesying, speaking in tongues. The apocryphal texts are full of such stories. But we should be skeptical. By the time these stories were written down, miracle tales had become standard hagiographic conventions. Every saint needed miracles to prove their holiness. The stories follow predictable patterns borrowed from other apostles' legends, from the Gospels, from pagan hero myths. They tell us what people believed saints should do, not necessarily what Jude actually did. Yet it's worth noting that first-century Christianity seems to have been charismatic in ways that make modern Christians uncomfortable. The apostles and early believers spoke in tongues, had visions, prophesied, healed the sick, cast out demons. Whether we explain these phenomena as supernatural gifts, as psychological states, as spiritual experiences, or as exaggerations in the telling, they were part of early Christian experience. Jude, as one of the 12 who had been with Jesus and had received the Spirit at Pentecost, would have been expected to manifest such gifts. The early Christians would have been disappointed, confused, if he didn't. One persistent tradition pairs Jude with Simon the Zealot in missionary work. This pairing appears in multiple sources and may preserve genuine memory. Simon had been a zealot, a member of the revolutionary movement that wanted to overthrow Roman rule through violence. Yet he had become an apostle of a kingdom not of this world, had abandoned armed resistance for spiritual transformation. If Simon and Jude traveled together, it would have been a fascinating partnership. The former revolutionary and the relative of Jesus, united in proclaiming a crucified Messiah. Their mission, according to tradition, took them to the edges of the known world. Persia, Mesopotamia, maybe even India, according to some accounts. These were regions where Roman power was distant or absent, where other empires held sway, where the cultures were ancient and sophisticated. Preaching Christianity there meant engaging not just with paganism, but with Zoroastrianism, with mystery cults, with philosophical traditions different from anything in the Greco-Roman world. It meant operating without the infrastructure of Jewish diaspora communities that Paul had leveraged. It meant being truly foreign, truly alone. The silence about these years is frustrating for historians, but evocative for the imagination. We can picture Jude walking dusty roads, entering strange cities, learning new languages, adapting his message to different audiences, establishing tiny communities of believers who would preserve his teaching after he moved on. We can imagine his loneliness, his homesickness, his doubt in dark moments about whether any of this mattered, whether he was accomplishing anything, whether anyone would remember or care. And perhaps this experience of being forgotten, of laboring in obscurity, of not seeing the fruit of his work, of wondering whether it all meant anything. Perhaps this is why Jude later became the patron of desperate cases, not because of something he taught or a miracle he performed, but because of how he lived, faithfully continuing when there was no recognition, no success, no apparent reason to hope. Doing the work because Jesus had called him to do it, not because it brought results or rewards. The historical Jude disappears into these silent years. We don't know where he went, what he did, what he said, whether he was successful or frustrated, happy or suffering. We know only that he persevered until his death, that he never recanted, that whatever he endured, he continued to proclaim Jesus as Lord. This faithfulness in obscurity, this persistence without recognition, would become the foundation of his later role as the saint for impossible situations. Part 3. The Martyrdom, History and Legend. The end of Jude's life is shrouded in the same fog of uncertainty that covers most of his story. We don't know for certain when he died, where he died, or how he died. We have traditions, accounts written centuries after the fact, stories that contradict each other, legends that mix historical memory with pious imagination. Yet the tradition that he died a martyr's death is ancient, persistent, and almost certainly true. The question is only the details. The most widespread tradition holds that Jude was martyred in Persia, in the city of Swamir, or possibly in Armenia. According to these accounts, he was preaching the gospel, making converts, threatening the power and prestige of the local pagan priests. These priests, seeing their influence waning, stirred up opposition against Jude. They brought him before the local authorities, accused him of undermining the established religion, of turning people away from the ancestral gods, of causing social unrest. The authorities demanded that Jude renounce his faith, that he acknowledge the superiority of the local deities, that he cease his preaching. Jude refused. The legends give him speeches of defiant faith. I am an apostle of Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God. I cannot and will not worship false gods made by human hands. Jesus alone is Lord, and him only will I serve. Whether he actually said such words, we cannot know, but the sentiment is surely accurate. Jude had not endured decades of hardship and danger to recant at the end. The manner of his death varies in different accounts. Some traditions say he was beaten to death with clubs. Others say he was beheaded. The most common account says he was killed with a halberd or axe struck down while preaching. This is why Jude is often depicted in Christian art holding a club or an axe, the instrument of his martyrdom. Some accounts say Simon the Zealot was martyred alongside him, the two apostles dying together as they had ministered together. Other accounts have them martyred in different places at different times. The historical reality is probably simpler and less dramatic than the legends. Jude likely died sometime between 60 and 80 AD, probably in his 60s or 70s. He probably died violently, killed by a mob, or executed by local authorities for religious crimes. The details, the specific city, the exact method, the final words, these were lost almost immediately. The early Christians were not historians carefully preserving factual accounts. They were believers testifying to faith, and their accounts prioritized theological meaning over historical precision. What matters more than the details is what martyrdom meant and why it mattered. In the early church, martyrdom was the ultimate witness. The Greek word martys means witness, and the martyrs were those who witnessed to Christ not just with words, but with their lives. To die rather than deny Christ, to endure torture rather than compromise faith, to choose death over apostasy. This was considered the highest expression of discipleship, the fullest imitation of Jesus, who had himself died rather than abandon his mission. The martyrs were revered almost immediately. Their death days became feast days. Their burial places became pilgrimage sites. Their remains became relics imbued with spiritual power. Stories of their martyrdoms were read in churches, elaborated and embellished over time. They became heroes of faith, examples to inspire courage in other believers facing persecution. The martyrs proved that Christianity was worth dying for, that the promise of resurrection was more real than the threat of death. For Jude specifically, martyrdom authenticated his apostleship. It connected him to the pattern established by Jesus and followed by most of the other apostles. According to tradition, all of the 12, except John, died violent deaths. Peter was crucified, tradition says upside down. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded by Herod. Thomas was speared to death in India. Andrew was crucified on an X-shaped cross. These martyrdoms became part of the apostles' identities, the final proof of their commitment. But where was Jude buried? Here again, we face competing claims and uncertain evidence. The strongest tradition says his body was brought back from Persia and buried in Rome, in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica. When the present basilica was built in the 16th century, excavations uncovered ancient tombs beneath it, including what was claimed to be Jude's. The relics were authenticated, or at least declared authentic, by church authorities and remain in St. Peter's today. enshrined in an altar with Simon the Zealot, the two apostles together in death, as they had been in mission. But other locations claim Jude's remains as well. Toulouse in France claims to have his bones, brought there during the Crusades. Various churches throughout Europe and the Middle East claim to possess his relics, a finger bone here, a piece of skull there. This multiplication of relics was common in medieval Christianity, driven by both pious fraud and confused identification. Saints' bodies were broken up and distributed, divided among multiple locations, copied and counterfeited. Whether any of these relics are authentic is impossible to verify and ultimately unimportant to believers, for whom the spiritual reality matters more than the physical artifact. The legends surrounding Jude's martyrdom grew more elaborate over time. Medieval hagiographies added miracles during his torture, visions before his death, supernatural phenomena at his execution. They had pagans converting at the sight of his courage, priests being struck blind for persecuting him, earthquakes and darkness accompanying his death. These embellishments follow standard patterns from martyrdom literature and almost certainly weren't part of the original accounts. But they served a purpose. They made Jude's story more vivid, more memorable, more inspiring to believers who heard them read aloud in church. One particularly interesting legendary detail is the claim that Jude carried a medallion or image of Jesus, supposedly given to him by Jesus himself. This image became known as the image of Edessa, or the Mandelion, a cloth bearing Jesus' face that was believed to have miraculous properties. The legend claimed Jude brought this image to King Abgar of Edessa, a Syrian city, and that the image healed the king and led to his conversion. While almost certainly fictional, this legend reveals something important. The association of Jude with images of Christ, with the visible manifestation of Jesus' presence, with bringing Christ's healing power to those who needed it. What can we say with reasonable historical confidence about Jude's death? He almost certainly died for his faith, killed because he proclaimed Jesus as Lord in a context where such proclamation was considered subversive, dangerous, or blasphemous. He probably died in the eastern reaches of the Christian mission, far from Jerusalem, far from the centers of power and record-keeping. He died without fanfare, without witnesses who would write down his last words, without the kind of public spectacle that characterized later Roman persecutions of Christians. He died obscurely, like he had lived. Yet his death meant he had persevered to the end. He had not abandoned the mission Jesus gave him at the Last Supper. He had not been bought off or frightened away or worn down by disappointment and difficulty. He had been faithful unto death and would receive, as Revelation promises, the crown of life. This faithfulness, more than any miracle or teaching, would become the foundation of Jude's later reputation as the saint who doesn't give up, the intercessor who stands with you even in impossible situations. The martyr's crown also gave Jude authority as an intercessor. Early Christians believed that martyrs had special status with God, that their prayers were particularly powerful, that they could intercede effectively for the living. This wasn't just pious speculation, but theological logic. If martyrs had been faithful unto death, if they had imitated Christ's sacrifice, if they now stood in the direct presence of God, surely God would hear their prayers with special favor. And so Christians began asking martyrs to pray for them, to intercede on their behalf, to carry their petitions to God. This practice of asking martyrs for intercession developed early and naturally in Christian communities. It wasn't initially about worshiping saints or replacing Christ as mediator. It was simply asking particularly holy and faithful Christians to pray for you, extending the practice of asking living friends and fellow believers to pray for you into the realm of those who had died and now lived with Christ. Whether this practice was theologically justified or subtly idolatrous would be debated for centuries, culminating in the Protestant Reformation's rejection of it. But for Catholics and Orthodox Christians, it remained central to faith and piety. For Jude specifically, martyrdom was the beginning, not the end, of his significance. His death established his credentials as a saint, but it would be centuries before he became widely known, before his particular patronage emerged, before the devotion that now makes him one of Christianity's most invoked saints would develop. The martyrdom authenticated him, but it didn't explain him. It made him a saint, but not yet the saint of impossible causes. That transformation would take much longer and would emerge from circumstances far removed from the circumstances of his death. Part 4. Centuries of Obscurity, the Forgotten Apostle. After Jude's death, he disappeared, not just from life, but from memory, not just from the historical record, but from the consciousness of most Christians. This is one of the strangest aspects of Jude's story. For roughly 15 centuries, he was barely known, barely venerated, barely invoked. In the great cathedrals being built across Europe, in the monasteries where monks copied manuscripts, in the churches where priests celebrated Mass, Jude was simply absent. Not rejected or condemned, just forgotten, overlooked, lost in the shadows cast by more prominent saints. Why was Jude forgotten? Several factors converged to obscure him. First, and most obviously, the name problem. Judas was toxic, irredeemably associated with betrayal. Even though Scripture carefully distinguished Jude from Judas Iscariot, the names were variants of the same name. Parents stopped naming children Judas or Jude. The name itself became cursed. And a saint with a cursed name was difficult to promote, dangerous to invoke. What if people confused the two? What if honoring Jude somehow honored the traitor? Better to focus on Peter, Paul, John, apostles whose names carried no such baggage. Second, Jude left almost no textual legacy. Unlike Paul, with his extensive letters, unlike Peter, who supposedly influenced Mark's gospel, unlike John, with his gospel and epistles and revelation, Jude had at most one brief letter, and even that authorship was contested. There was no developed Judean theology, no distinctive teachings attributed to him, no sayings or sermons preserved in early Christian literature. He was simply one of the 12, functionally interchangeable with the other less prominent apostles, distinguished only by his unfortunate name. Third, his mission field was in the East. Persia, Mesopotamia, Armenia, regions that became culturally and ecclesiastically separated from the Latin West. As Christianity split into Eastern and Western branches, as the cultures diverged, as language barriers made communication difficult, the saints venerated in one region often remained unknown in the other. Jude was remembered in Armenia, where the national church claimed apostolic foundation by him. But Armenia was at the edge of Christendom, constantly threatened by Persian and later Muslim conquest, its traditions and devotions largely unknown to Western European Christians. Fourth, there was competition. The calendar of saints was crowded. Every day of the year, had multiple saints associated with it, martyrs from various regions and eras, each with their devotees and patronages. To gain prominence, a saint needed distinctive characteristics, compelling stories, powerful miracles, influential promoters. Jude had none of these. He was generic, forgettable, one more martyr in a vast cloud of witnesses. Why pray to Jude when you could pray to Mary, to Peter, to the patron saint of your city, or your occupation, or your particular need? The evidence of Jude's obscurity is striking. In the early Christian centuries, church fathers rarely mention him. When they list the apostles, he's there, but with no elaboration, no stories, no theological development. The great theological controversies that shaped Christian doctrine, debates about the Trinity, the nature of Christ, original sin, grace, predestination, none of these involved Jude or his supposed teachings. He contributed nothing to the formation of Christian theology as it was formally articulated and defended. Medieval hagiographies, those collections of saints' lives that were read aloud in churches and monasteries, include Jude but give him minimal attention. The Golden Legend, the most popular collection of saints' stories compiled by Jacobus de Voragine in the 13th century, has an entry for Jude. But it's brief, uncertain, mostly concerned with disentangling the various figures named Judas, Jude in Scripture. The miracles attributed to him are generic, borrowing elements from other apostles' legends. The entry feels perfunctory, obligatory, like the author knew he should include Jude, but had little material to work with. Church dedications tell a similar story. Across medieval Europe, thousands of churches were built and dedicated to various saints. Peter and Paul were most common, followed by Mary, John the Baptist, and various local martyrs. Dedications to Jude were exceedingly rare. A few existed. There was a church of Saint Jude in Rome, another in London, but they were anomalies. Most Christians could live their entire lives without ever encountering a church dedicated to Jude, without hearing a sermon about him, without seeing his image in stained glass or sculpture. This absence extended to art and iconography. Medieval and Renaissance art depicting the apostles usually showed the 12 together at the Last Supper or receiving the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. In these group scenes, Jude was present but undifferentiated, one more bearded figure in the crowd, lacking distinctive attributes or identifying characteristics. When apostles were depicted individually, the focus was almost always on Peter, Paul, John, and sometimes James. The others, including Jude, were rarely portrayed. When Jude was depicted individually, artists struggled with how to represent him. They eventually settled on certain attributes: holding a club or axe, instruments of martyrdom; holding a medallion or image of Jesus, referencing the Edessa legend; sometimes holding a carpenter's square or a boat. But these attributes weren't standardized, weren't universally recognized. The iconography was confused and late developing, suggesting artists were creating symbols because saints needed symbols, not because there was clear tradition about what symbolized Jude specifically. The liturgical calendar reflects the same neglect. Jude's feast day, October 28th, was celebrated in some places, but not universally. It shared the date with Simon the Zealot. The two apostles jointly commemorated as they had supposedly been jointly martyred. But the feast was of low rank, overshadowed by more important celebrations nearby in the calendar. Few churches would have observed it with any special solemnity. It was there, officially, but practically invisible. Relics show a similar pattern, In an age when relics were desperately sought after, when churches competed to possess saints' bones, when relics were stolen, forged, and sold for enormous sums, Jude's relics generated little interest. Yes, his body supposedly lay in St. Peter's in Rome, but it was not a major pilgrimage destination, not a source of notable miracles, not particularly promoted by the church authorities. Other apostles' relics were more desirable, more powerful, more worth acquiring. This centuries-long obscurity had profound effects on Jude's eventual revival. When devotion to him finally developed, it developed from a position of complete obscurity. Unlike saints, who had ancient and continuous devotional traditions, Jude was being discovered, or rediscovered, or perhaps really invented for the first time. His identity as patron of hopeless cases, of desperate situations, of last resort, none of this had deep historical roots. It emerged late, in specific contexts, for specific reasons. The forgotten apostle was given a new role, a new purpose, a new meaning. But why was he forgotten in the first place? Beyond the practical reasons already mentioned, there might be something more theologically significant. Jude's obscurity reflects Christianity's tendency to focus on the spectacular, the successful, the clearly significant. Peter gets remembered because he's the rock on which Jesus built his church, because he preached at Pentecost, because he's credited with founding the church in Rome. Paul gets remembered because he wrote half the New Testament, because his theology shaped Christian thought for centuries, because his missionary journeys are carefully documented. These are men whose significance is obvious, whose contributions are measurable. But Jude did none of these things, or if he did, they weren't recorded, weren't noticed, weren't considered important enough to preserve. He represents the countless Christians who served faithfully without recognition, who did the work without seeing the results, who died without anyone writing their story. He represents the hiddenness of most Christian life, the obscurity of most Christian service, the apparent insignificance of most Christian suffering. He is, in this sense, deeply representative, not exceptional, but typical, not the hero, but the ordinary believer. This representative quality, this embodiment of hiddenness and obscurity, would eventually become central to Jude's appeal. But that development was still centuries away. First, there had to be a revival, a rediscovery, a transformation from forgotten apostle to beloved saint. That transformation began slowly, almost accidentally, in ways that would have been impossible to predict from the long centuries of silence. Part 5. The Great Revival. How the Forgotten Became Beloved. The revival of devotion to Saint Jude began, like much in Christian history, by accident and necessity rather than by plan. In the 17th and 18th centuries, several factors converged to pull this obscure apostle from the shadows and thrust him into spiritual prominence. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual process, starting in specific places with specific groups before spreading more widely. Understanding this revival requires understanding the religious, social, and psychological context that made people need a saint like Jude. The Counter-Reformation played a crucial role. After the Protestant Reformation shattered Western Christian unity in the 16th century, the Catholic Church mounted an aggressive response. The Council of Trent reaffirmed traditional Catholic doctrines, including the veneration of saints and the efficacy of their intercession. New religious orders, especially the Jesuits, spread throughout the Catholic world with missionary zeal. Catholic devotion became more emotional, more personal, more focused on intimate relationships with Jesus, Mary, and the saints. This was partly genuine religious revival and partly defensive response, Catholicism distinguishing itself from Protestant austerity through elaborate ritual, emotional piety, and proliferating devotions. In this environment, saints became more important, not less. Each saint offered a different path to God, a different form of help, a different spiritual relationship. The Church actively promoted saint devotion as distinctively Catholic, as something Protestants had foolishly abandoned. New devotions were encouraged, old devotions were revitalized, previously minor saints were elevated. This created opportunity for Jude to be rediscovered and promoted. The first major site of Jude revival was in Rome itself. St. Peter's Basilica, rebuilt in the 16th and 17th centuries, housed Jude's relics in its crypt. Church authorities began promoting this connection, encouraging pilgrims to visit Jude's tomb, attributing miracles to his intercession. Gradually, devotion grew. Confraternities dedicated to Jude formed, groups of lay believers who met regularly to pray to him, to celebrate his feast, to spread his cult. By the 18th century, Jude was well known in Rome, with his own devotional literature, prayers, novenas. But it was in the Americas, particularly in Latin America and later North America, that Jude devotion truly exploded. Spanish and Portuguese colonizers brought Catholicism to the New World, bringing with them the full panoply of saints. In the difficult circumstances of colonial life, disease, violence, exploitation, the trauma of conquest, people needed saints who understood desperation, who could be called on in impossible situations. Jude, the forgotten apostle, was perfectly positioned for this role. Mexican devotion to Saint Jude Thaddeus became particularly intense. In Mexico City, the parish church of San Hipólito became a major center of Jude veneration. Every month, on the 28th, thousands of devotees would gather for a special mass and blessing. The devotion crossed all social boundaries. Poor and rich, indigenous and Spanish, criminals and respectable citizens all came to pray to San Judas. The saint became associated with the desperate, the marginalized, those with nowhere else to turn. His image, the medallion of Jesus on his chest, the club of martyrdom, the green robe of hope, became ubiquitous. In the United States, Jude devotion came later, but grew with remarkable speed. The key promoters were the Claretian missionaries, a Catholic religious order founded in Spain in the 19th century. In 1929, the Claretians opened the National Shrine of Saint Jude in Chicago, specifically dedicated to promoting devotion to the forgotten apostle. This was a calculated decision, made partly for practical reasons. The shrine needed a patron saint, and Jude was available, unclaimed by other orders. But it proved profoundly consequential. The timing was perfect. The shrine opened just months before the stock market crash of 1929 that initiated the Great Depression. As economic catastrophe engulfed the country, as millions lost their jobs, their savings, their homes, as desperation became the normal human condition, people needed a saint for desperate times. The Claretians promoted Jude aggressively through advertising, publications, prayer cards, broadcasts. They called him the Saint of the Impossible, the patron of hopeless cases, the Saint of Last Resort. These titles resonated powerfully with Depression-era audiences. The Claretians developed sophisticated marketing strategies that seemed jarring from a religious organization. They placed ads in newspapers and magazines. They sent out mailings. they published a magazine called The Voice of Saint Jude that shared testimonies of answered prayers and miraculous interventions. They encouraged people to write to the shrine with their desperate needs, promising that priests would pray to Saint Jude on their behalf. Thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of letters poured in. People asked for healing, for jobs, for reconciliation, for protection, for help with impossible debts and insurmountable problems. And testimonies of miracles multiplied. People reported finding work after praying to Saint Jude. Marriages were saved, illnesses healed, financial disasters averted. Whether these were genuine miracles, coincidences, psychological effects, or exaggerations doesn't really matter for understanding the devotion's growth. What matters is that people believed, that they shared their stories, that the testimonies created a feedback loop. Miraculous answers led to more devotion, which led to more prayers, which led to more reported miracles, which led to even more devotion. Other shrines and churches dedicated to Jude opened across the United States. In Baltimore, in New York, in Los Angeles, in countless smaller cities. Prayer groups formed. Novenas were widely distributed. Holy cards bearing Jude's image became ubiquitous in Catholic homes. By the mid-20th century, Jude had gone from complete obscurity to being one of the most popular saints in American Catholicism. Surveys in the 1960s found that Jude was the third most popular saint after Mary and Joseph, despite having been virtually unknown a generation earlier. What explains this explosive growth? Several factors converged. First, the historical moment. Economic depression, world war, social upheaval created desperate need. Second, aggressive promotion by religious orders who had institutional incentives to promote their shrine and its patron. Third, the lack of established devotion meant Jude could be shaped to meet contemporary needs without contradicting centuries of tradition. Fourth, the name problem that had kept him obscure became an asset. People who were themselves forgotten, marginalized, dismissed, identified with the forgotten apostle. But perhaps most important was the theological niche that Jude filled. Catholic devotional practice already had saints for specific needs. Anthony for lost objects, Christopher for travelers, Lucy for eye problems, Blay for throat ailments. But there was no saint specifically for hopeless cases, for situations where all other avenues had been exhausted, for prayers that seemed impossible. Jude filled that void. He became the saint you turned to when you'd tried everything else and failed, when medical science offered no hope, when your financial situation was beyond salvaging, when your relationship was past repair. This created a paradox at the heart of Jude devotion. He was simultaneously the last resort and the most powerful intercessor. You called on him when nothing else worked, which implied he was somehow more capable than other saints, more willing to take on impossible cases, more effective at moving God's hand. The theological logic was questionable. Why would one saint be more powerful than another? Why would God respond to Jude but not to other holy intercessors? But the devotional logic was powerful. Jude was your advocate when you had no other advocate, your hope when you had no other hope. The prayers composed for Jude reflect this desperation and this trust. The most famous Jude prayer, still widely used, declares, "Most Holy Apostle, Saint Jude, faithful servant and friend of Jesus, the Church honors and invokes you universally as the patron of hopeless cases, of things almost despaired of. Pray for me. I am so helpless and alone. Make use, I implore you, of that particular privilege given to you, to bring visible and speedy help where help is almost despaired of. Come to my assistance in this great need, that I may receive the consolation and help of heaven in all my necessities, tribulations, and sufferings. The theology is loose. What exactly is this particular privilege? Where is it documented? But the emotion is raw and real. Another prayer, the Saint Jude Novena, is prayed for 9 consecutive days when seeking the saint's intercession for a particular intention. It combines petition with promises. I will make your name known and cause you to be invoked. This creates a contractual element. I pray to you, you answer my prayer. I then spread your devotion to others. This promise to publicize Jude's help, if help is received, has been a major factor in the spread of his devotion. Answered prayers lead to testimonies. Testimonies lead to new devotees. New devotees lead to more prayers, and the cycle perpetuates itself. The revival of Jude devotion is in many ways a story about how religion works in modern commercial society. It required marketing, required meeting consumer needs, required testimonials and advertising and branded merchandise. The Claretians essentially marketed St. Jude like a product, identifying a market gap, hopeless cases, positioning their saint to fill that gap, and promoting him through modern media. This could be seen as crassly commercial, or as shrewdly adapting religious practice to contemporary culture. Either way, it worked. By the late 20th century, Jude was everywhere in Catholic culture. Danny Thomas, the famous American entertainer, credited St. Jude with saving his career and went on to found St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, one of the world's leading pediatric treatment centers. The hospital's name spread Jude's recognition far beyond specifically Catholic contexts. People who knew nothing about Christian saints knew about St. Jude's Hospital, associating the name with healing children, with hope against impossible medical odds. Popular culture embraced Jude as well. Songs mentioned him. Movies referenced him. Television shows depicted characters praying to him in desperate moments. He became a cultural symbol, understood beyond his religious origins. St. Jude meant last-ditch hope, meant refusing to give up when everything looked hopeless, meant believing in the impossible. The forgotten apostle had become a household name. This transformation from obscurity to prominence, from forgotten to beloved, raises interesting questions about how religious devotion actually works. It suggests that saints are not just discovered, but constructed, that their patronages and meanings are assigned rather than inherent, that devotional practice responds to human needs more than to historical facts. Jude became the saint of impossible causes, not because he had been that during his life or immediately after his death, but because 20th century Catholics needed such a saint, and he was available to fill the role. Yet from a believer's perspective, this human explanation doesn't contradict divine providence. Perhaps God intentionally kept Jude obscure for centuries so that he would be available when desperately needed. Perhaps the Holy Spirit guided the revival of Jude devotion precisely because these particular times required this particular saint. Perhaps what looks like marketing and social construction from the outside is actually spiritual movement from the inside. The question cannot be definitively answered, which is perhaps appropriate for the saint of impossible answers. Part 6. The Theology of Desperation. Why Jude resonates. Why does St. Jude resonate so powerfully with people facing desperate situations? What is it about this saint specifically that makes him the intercessor for impossible cases? The answer lies not in who Jude was historically, but in what he represents theologically and psychologically, in how his story and his obscurity map onto the experience of human desperation. Desperation is a specific spiritual and psychological state. It's not just difficulty or challenge. It's the sense that the situation is impossible, that all normal solutions have been exhausted, that the resources available are completely inadequate to the need. Desperation involves a recognition of powerlessness, an admission that you cannot solve this problem through your own effort or ingenuity. It's the point where hope based on reasonable probability has run out, where continuing to hope requires something beyond reason, either delusion or faith. Every religious tradition has resources for addressing desperation, but they differ significantly in their approaches. Some emphasize acceptance, learning to let go of what you cannot control, finding peace in surrender to divine will. Some emphasize transformation of desire, realizing that what you desperately want may not be what you truly need, that your desperation reflects attachment to false goods. Some emphasize solidarity, remembering that others suffer more, that your desperation is shared, that you are not alone. Catholic tradition, with its elaborate system of saints and intercessors, offers a distinctive approach: specialized advocacy. When you face an impossible situation, you seek out the saint who specializes in such situations, who has a track record of handling desperate cases, who has special access or influence or sympathy relevant to your specific need. This creates a kind of spiritual bureaucracy, where different saints have different jurisdictions, different areas of expertise, different types of cases they handle. Saint Jude's jurisdiction is specifically impossible cases, hopeless situations, desperate circumstances. But why him? The historical Jude gives us very little to work with. No miracles of his lifetime, no teachings about desperation, no stories of helping people in impossible situations. So the patronage must emerge from something else, from the symbolic meaning of his story, rather than its literal content. The key is his obscurity. Jude was forgotten, overlooked, his name confused with the betrayers, his accomplishments unrecorded, his significance unrecognized. For 1,500 years, nobody prayed to him, nobody invoked him, nobody even thought about him. He was as invisible and insignificant as a saint could be, while technically remaining in the calendar. This obscurity makes him perfect for those who feel themselves forgotten by God, overlooked in their need, insignificant in their suffering. Think about what it feels like to face a desperate situation. You feel alone, invisible, like your suffering doesn't matter to anyone. You feel forgotten by God, like your prayers aren't being heard or aren't worth God's attention. You feel that your case is uniquely difficult, that the normal channels of help don't apply to you, that you've fallen through the cracks of both human and divine assistance. In this state, praying to prominent saints can feel futile. They're too busy with more important cases, too distant from your particular desperation, too exalted to care about your small, desperate need. But Jude understands being overlooked. He understands being forgotten. He understands having people not even know your name or confuse you with someone else. He understands laboring in obscurity without recognition or results. He is, in a profound sense, a fellow sufferer, someone who knows what it's like to be dismissed and ignored. This creates identification, the sense that Jude gets it, that he understands your situation not abstractly, but from his own experience. Moreover, Jude's obscurity means he's available. He doesn't have millions of other petitions to handle. He's not overwhelmed with requests like Mary or Joseph or the more popular saints. He has time for your case, attention for your particular need, capacity to focus on your desperate situation. This is illogical theologically. Saints presumably don't have limited bandwidth, don't get overwhelmed by too many requests, but it's psychologically powerful. The forgotten saint has capacity to remember you. There's also a folk theological logic at work. Jude has something to prove. Because he was forgotten for so long, because his reputation and devotion are relatively recent, he needs to demonstrate his power through spectacular interventions. He needs to build his resume, so to speak, by taking on the hard cases that other saints might avoid. He needs dramatic miracles, not routine favors, to establish his credentials. So he welcomes impossible cases, even seeks them out, because success with impossible cases is what builds a saint's reputation. Again, this doesn't match official Catholic theology about how saints work. The Church teaches that saints don't compete with each other, don't have reputational concerns, don't need to prove anything. They simply intercede for us with God, according to God's will. But popular devotion operates with its own logic, mixing official theology with human psychology and cultural assumptions. And in popular devotion, Jude is the hungry underdog, the saint with something to prove, the intercessor who takes the cases others won't. The contractual element in Jude devotion reinforces this. Many Jude prayers include promises. I will make your name known. I will never cease to honor you. I will spread your devotion. This creates an exchange. Jude helps you. You help Jude by increasing his devotion and recognition. It's a partnership of mutual benefit. You get your impossible situation resolved. Jude gets more devotees and more recognition. This transactional quality bothers some theologians, but resonates with people who want to feel they have something to offer, even in their powerlessness. The desperation that drives people to Jude also opens them to interpretations of answered prayer that might otherwise seem like coincidence. When you're desperate, when you're praying to the patron of impossible causes, any positive development can feel miraculous. You prayed to Saint Jude about your hopeless job search, and then a week later, an unexpected opportunity appeared. Is this a miracle? A coincidence? The fruit of continuing to look while also praying? From within the experience, it doesn't matter. It's experienced as Jude's intervention, and that experience generates gratitude, testimony, increased devotion. This creates what sociologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. The belief that Jude helps with desperate cases leads people to pray to him in desperate cases. Some percentage of desperate cases resolve positively because most desperate situations do eventually resolve one way or another. Those positive resolutions are attributed to Jude's intercession. The testimonies of these resolutions encourage more people to pray to Jude. More prayers mean more chances for positive resolutions that can be attributed to his intercession. And the cycle continues, building a body of testimonies that prove Jude's special power over impossible cases. But we should not be completely cynical about this. From a believer's perspective, the fact that the mechanism works psychologically and sociologically doesn't disprove its spiritual reality. Perhaps God uses these natural mechanisms as the means through which divine grace flows. Perhaps the psychological comfort that comes from praying to a saint who understands opens people to perceiving grace they would otherwise miss. Perhaps the act of framing one's desperate situation as a petition to a specific saint creates the mental and spiritual space for hope to survive when reason says the situation is hopeless. The theology of desperation that Jude embodies is ultimately about the survival of hope beyond the point where hope seems rationally justified. Desperation is the state where rational hope has been exhausted. You've tried everything reasonable, and it hasn't worked. You've consulted experts, and they've said it's impossible. You've done the math, and the numbers don't add up. Continuing to hope at this point requires either delusion, refusing to accept reality, or faith, believing that reality is not the whole story, that there are resources beyond the visible and calculable, that the impossible sometimes becomes possible. Jude devotion is fundamentally about maintaining this hope beyond the point of reason. When you light a candle to Saint Jude, when you pray the novena, when you carry his medal, when you make your petition, you are performing an act of resistance against despair. You are saying, I know this looks impossible, but I'm not giving up. I know the doctors say there's no hope, but I'm still praying for healing. I know the financial situation seems beyond salvaging, but I'm still asking for help. I know the relationship appears irreparable, but I'm still hoping for reconciliation. This resistance against despair is itself spiritually significant, regardless of whether the specific petition is granted. The act of continuing to hope, of refusing to surrender to hopelessness, of maintaining the prayer life even when prayer seems futile. These are acts of faith that have value independent of their outcomes. They keep the person connected to the transcendent, oriented toward grace, open to possibility. They prevent the complete spiritual collapse that despair represents. From this perspective, Jude's role is not primarily to work miracles, but to sustain hope. The miracle is not the external change in circumstances, but the internal preservation of faith when everything argues for its abandonment. Jude becomes the companion in the darkness, the presence that whispers, "Don't give up," when giving up seems like the only rational response. Whether the desperate situation resolves favorably or not, the person who has maintained hope through Jude's intercession has accomplished something spiritually significant. This understanding helps make sense of cases where people pray to Jude and their desperate situation doesn't improve. By conventional logic, this should undermine devotion. Why pray to a saint who doesn't deliver? But Jude devotees typically interpret such cases differently. They say Jude gave them strength to endure, peace to accept what couldn't be changed, or different help than what they asked for. The desperate situation may have remained impossible, but they didn't face it alone. They had Jude's companionship, his intercession, his understanding, and that, they report, made the difference between despair and endurance. This brings us to the deepest theological question. Is Jude devotion authentic Christianity, or is it a kind of baptized superstition? Critics, especially Protestant Christians, argue that Catholic saint devotion in general, and Jude devotion in particular, crosses the line into idolatry. They note that Jesus is the only necessary mediator, that we can approach God directly through Christ, that saints are at best unnecessary and at worst competitors with Christ for the faith and devotion that belong to God alone. They see Jude devotion as magical thinking, treating the saint like a lucky charm, expecting automatic results from the right prayers, focusing on the intercessor rather than on God. Defenders respond that saint devotion properly understood is simply asking holy people to pray for you, which is no different from asking living friends to pray. They note that Scripture calls believers to pray for each other, that the church is one body in which living and dead members remain in communion, that the cloud of witnesses remains concerned with earthly affairs. They argue that honoring saints doesn't detract from God any more than honoring one's parents detracts from God, that all grace comes ultimately from God through Christ, regardless of which saint intercedes, that Catholic theology explicitly rejects any notion of saints having independent power apart from God. The debate cannot be resolved here, and perhaps cannot be resolved at all, because it rests on fundamentally different understandings of how divine grace operates and how human and divine agency interact. What can be said is that Jude devotion represents a particular approach to the problem of human desperation, an approach that emphasizes personal relationship with holy intercessors, that values the accumulated holiness of the saints as resources available to the Church, that sees prayer as operating through a complex spiritual economy involving angels and saints as well as the Trinity. Whether this approach is theologically justified or spiritually beneficial remains contested. What is not contested is that it provides comfort and hope to millions of people facing impossible situations. Whether that comfort is based on spiritual reality or on psychological projection, whether the hope is supernaturally sustained or naturally generated, whether Jude's intercession is real intervention or meaningful symbol, these questions may ultimately matter less than the fact that desperate people find something in Jude devotion that helps them survive their desperation. And survival of desperation, maintenance of hope against hope, is itself a kind of miracle in a world full of reasons for despair. Part 7. The practice of Jude devotion, rituals and testimonies. How does Jude devotion actually work in practice? What do people do when they turn to Saint Jude with their desperate situations? The practice has developed its own rituals, its own rhythms, its own expectations and patterns. Understanding these practices reveals not just Catholic devotional culture, but something deeper about how humans try to engage with the transcendent in moments of crisis. The most common practice is the novena, 9 consecutive days of prayer to Saint Jude, asking for his intercession for a particular intention. The number 9 has ancient spiritual significance, appearing repeatedly in Christian tradition. Christ appeared to his disciples for 9 days after the ascension before Pentecost, 9 months of pregnancy, 9 choirs of angels, 9 First Fridays. Novenas exist for many saints, but Jude's novena is among the most popular, prayed by people who might not engage in any other formal devotional practices. The structure is simple, but demands commitment. Each day for 9 days, you pray specific prayers. The Jude Novena prayer, often along with Our Fathers, Hail Marys, and Glory Bees. You state your intention, what you're desperately asking for. You promise to make Jude's name known if your petition is granted, typically by publishing a thank you notice in a newspaper or sharing your testimony. Then you trust, you wait, you hope. What makes the novena psychologically and spiritually significant is its extended commitment. You can't just say a quick prayer and be done. You must return daily, must maintain focus on your petition, must sustain the prayer practice even when nothing appears to be changing. This daily repetition creates several effects. It keeps the desperate situation before God consistently rather than in one moment of crisis. It disciplines the mind to hope rather than despair, to pray rather than panic. It creates a structure that holds you when everything else feels chaotic. The novena also builds anticipation. You're not just praying indefinitely with no expectation of resolution. You're praying for 9 days, and the implicit expectation is that by the end, or shortly thereafter, something will happen. This time limit creates psychological momentum and prevents the prayer from dissolving into vague, indefinite hoping. You're doing something active, something structured, something that will reach completion, even if your desperate situation hasn't resolved. Beyond the novena, Jude devotion involves various material practices. People wear Saint Jude medals, small pendants depicting the saint that serve as both reminder and talisman. They keep holy cards with Jude's image in their wallets or Bibles. They light candles to Saint Jude in churches, the physical act of lighting representing the prayer, the burning flame symbolizing the petition rising to heaven. They keep statues or pictures of Saint Jude in their homes, creating a visual focal point for prayer. These material practices serve multiple functions. Practically, they provide tangible ways to engage in devotion when words feel inadequate. Psychologically, they externalize internal spiritual reality, making the invisible visible and the abstract concrete. Theologically, they reflect Catholic sacramental sensibility, the belief that material things can mediate spiritual realities, that grace flows through physical means, that the spiritual and material are interconnected rather than separate. Pilgrimages to Jude shrines represent the most intensive form of devotion. The Chicago Shrine receives hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, people coming specifically to pray at Jude's shrine, to attend special masses on his feast day, to light candles, to leave written petitions. Other Jude shrines exist in Baltimore, New York, Los Angeles, and internationally. These pilgrimages involve effort and sacrifice, time off work, travel expenses, physical exertion, which themselves become offerings, ways of demonstrating sincerity and commitment. At these shrines, you can witness the full spectrum of human desperation. People pray, audibly, weeping, pleading. Others kneel silently, their stillness conveying what words cannot. Parents pray for children with terminal illnesses. Unemployed workers pray for jobs. Immigrants pray for legal status. Addicts pray for sobriety. People facing eviction pray for financial miracles. The dying pray for healing or for grace to face death. The lonely pray for love. The heartbroken pray for reconciliation. Every human desperate situation finds representation. The shrines also display testimonies, letters, published thank yous, plaques expressing gratitude for answered prayers. These testimonies serve multiple purposes. They provide evidence of Jude's power, encouraging others to pray with confidence. They fulfill the promise made during the novena to publicize Jude's intercession. They create community among Jude devotees, connecting people who've been through desperate situations and found help. And they generate the feedback loop that sustains and grows devotion. Testimonies inspire prayers, inspire more testimonies, inspire more prayers. Reading these testimonies reveals patterns. Many describe situations where medical professionals said there was no hope, but the patient recovered. financial catastrophes that resolved unexpectedly, legal situations that seemed lost but turned around, relationships that appeared irreparable but reconciled, addictions that were miraculously conquered, jobs that materialized against all odds. The common thread is the impossibility, not just difficulty, but situations where every reasonable avenue had been exhausted and failure seemed certain. The language of the testimonies is revealing. People almost always emphasize how desperate the situation was, how they'd tried everything else, how this was their last resort. This framing is important for several reasons. It establishes that the positive outcome wasn't natural or expected, making it seem more miraculous. It shows that Jude really is the patron of impossible cases by demonstrating the impossibility of the cases he handles. And it provides narrative drama. The situation was hopeless. Then Jude intervened. Then everything changed. The testimonies also frequently emphasize the specificity of Jude's help. Not just that things generally got better, but that the particular thing requested happened in a particular way at a particular time. Someone prayed for a specific job and got exactly that job. Someone prayed by a specific deadline, and the answer came on that deadline. These specificities make the intervention seem more personal, more tailored, more clearly responsive to the prayer, rather than coincidental. What about cases where people pray to Jude and nothing changes? These rarely appear in published testimonies for obvious reasons. People whose prayers weren't answered don't typically write thank you letters. But conversations with disappointed devotees reveal several patterns of response. Some attribute the lack of answer to their own inadequate faith or sinful life. They weren't worthy of the miracle. Some believe they were asking for the wrong thing, that Jude or God knew better than they did what they truly needed. Others believe the answer was no, or not yet, that God has a plan they don't understand, that the timing isn't right, or the request isn't aligned with their spiritual good. Some find that while the specific petition wasn't granted, they received different graces: strength to endure, peace in suffering, spiritual growth through the difficulty. And some abandoned Jude devotion, disappointed and disillusioned, feeling betrayed, or concluding it was superstition all along. The diversity of responses shows that Jude devotion, like all religious practice, is interpreted through the lens of broader theological frameworks and personal experiences. The same objective outcome, prayers not answered, can be understood as proof of Jude's ineffectiveness, as evidence of divine wisdom choosing different paths, as punishment for sin, as test of faith, or as redirection toward deeper spiritual goods. The interpretation depends on the interpreter's existing beliefs, expectations, and capacity to integrate suffering and disappointment into their worldview. One particularly interesting aspect of Jude devotion is its relationship with Catholic social teaching about poverty and justice. Many Jude devotees are poor, marginalized, oppressed, people whose desperate situations result not from random misfortune, but from systemic injustice. They pray to Saint Jude for jobs in an economy that's structurally designed to keep them unemployed. They pray for healing when they lack health insurance. They pray for legal help when facing unjust immigration systems. They pray for safety in violent neighborhoods that receive inadequate police protection. From one perspective, this represents false consciousness, using religion to cope with injustice rather than organizing to resist it. Rather than demanding economic justice, They pray for individual miraculous intervention. Rather than challenging systems, they seek exemption from their effects. Rather than collective action for structural change, they turn to individualized spiritual solutions. The critique is that Jude devotion anesthetizes people to injustice, makes them passive in the face of oppression, provides supernatural explanations for problems that have natural causes and natural solutions. From another perspective, Jude devotion represents spiritual resistance and survival in the face of overwhelming structural evil. People trapped in unjust systems with no realistic hope of changing those systems maintain their dignity and agency through prayer. They refuse to be completely crushed by their circumstances. They assert that their suffering matters to God, even if it doesn't matter to society. They maintain hope, not just for external rescue, but for internal preservation of their humanity. And they create communities of mutual support and solidarity through shared devotion, which itself has political potential, even if not directly activist. The truth probably lies somewhere between these perspectives and varies case by case. Some people do use Jude devotion as a substitute for necessary action. Others combine fervent prayer with intense activism, seeing Jude as ally in their struggle for justice rather than as alternative to that struggle. The relationship between prayer and action, between spiritual devotion and political engagement, remains complex and contested. What cannot be denied is that Jude devotion meets real human needs. It provides hope when hope has been exhausted. It offers companionship when people feel abandoned. It creates structure and meaning in chaos. It connects desperate individuals into communities of shared experience. It preserves faith when circumstances argue for despair. Whether these benefits come from supernatural intercession or from natural psychological and social processes, they are real and significant to those who experience them. The rituals, the testimonies, the material practices, the shrines, the community, all of these comprise what might be called the Jude devotion ecosystem. It's a complete religious world within Catholicism, with its own literature, its own sacred spaces, its own narratives and expectations, its own ways of interpreting experience. For those who participate in this world, Jude is not just an historical figure from the 1st century, but a living presence, an active intercessor, a constant companion in whatever desperate situation they face. Part 8. Jude in the Modern World. Contemporary Challenges and Meanings. Saint Jude has entered the 21st century as one of Christianity's most invoked saints. But modernity presents challenges and questions that would have been unimaginable to the early church, or even to the devotional revival of a century ago. How does ancient saint devotion function in a secularizing world? What does it mean to pray to a 1st century apostle about contemporary problems like student debt, artificial intelligence, climate change, pandemic disease? How does Jude devotion adapt to shifting religious sensibilities, to changing understandings of how prayer works, to increasing religious pluralism and declining institutional religious affiliation? The first challenge is intellectual. Modern educated people, including many Catholics, have difficulty with the metaphysical assumptions underlying saint devotion. The idea that disembodied souls of dead people can hear millions of simultaneous prayers, can intercede with God on behalf of specific petitioners, can somehow act in the material world to bring about specific outcomes. This strikes many modern minds as magical thinking incompatible with scientific worldviews. Even those who believe in God and Christian revelation often struggle with the specifics of how saint intercession supposedly works. The Catholic response has been to emphasize that saint devotion is fundamentally about prayer, not magic. Saints don't have independent power to grant requests. They can only intercede with God, asking God to grant what the petitioner needs. This intercession is valuable because saints are holy, close to God, exemplary in faith, and presumably their prayers carry special weight. But ultimately, all grace comes from God through Christ. The saint is simply an additional prayer partner, someone asking on your behalf. But this explanation doesn't fully satisfy skeptics. If saints can only pray to God for you, why not pray directly to God yourself? What does the intermediary add? Catholics answer that we can and should pray directly to God, but that asking saints to pray for us is like asking friends to pray for us, simply utilizing all available spiritual resources. The communion of saints means the Church includes both living and dead believers, all of whom can pray for each other. This is theologically coherent, but requires accepting premises about post-mortem consciousness, about the dead's awareness of earthly affairs, about the efficacy of prayer itself that many moderns find difficult. The second challenge is the problem of evil and suffering. If Jude can intervene in impossible situations, why doesn't he intervene in all of them? Why do some children with terminal cancer get miraculously healed while others die despite fervent prayers to Saint Jude? Why does one person's desperate financial situation resolve while another's leads to homelessness? If we say that Jude helps with impossible cases, but then admit that many impossible cases don't improve despite prayers to him, what claim are we actually making? It starts to sound like a non-falsifiable claim. If it works, Jude helped. If it doesn't work, God's will must be different. This is a version of the broader problem of petitionary prayer, which has troubled theodicy for millennia. If God is perfectly good and all-knowing, wouldn't God already give us what we need without being asked? If God answers some prayers, but not others, what determines the difference? The intensity of prayer, the holiness of the petitioner, the nature of the request, inscrutable divine will? None of these answers is entirely satisfying. The first makes God seem manipulable, the second unjust, the third arbitrary, the fourth incomprehensible. Jude devotion doesn't solve these philosophical problems. No devotional practice does, but it offers an existential response rather than a philosophical one. In desperate situations, you need to do something, and prayer is something you can do. Even if you're not sure how it works, even if you have theological doubts, even if you've seen prayers go unanswered before, when you face an impossible situation, you pray. Because what else is there? Jude becomes the patron, not of philosophical certainty, but of existential hope, the saint who represents continuing to pray, even when you're not sure prayer makes sense. The third challenge is religious pluralism. Jude devotion developed in culturally Catholic contexts where everyone shared basic assumptions about saints and intercession. But now many Jude devotees live in religiously diverse societies, work alongside people of different faiths or no faith, encounter regular challenges to Catholic distinctives. How does Jude devotion function in interfaith marriages, in workplaces where discussing saint devotion seems strange, in families where some members are Catholic and others are Protestant or secular? Some devotees respond by becoming more private about their practice. Jude becomes a personal secret rather than a public devotion. They wear their medals under clothing, pray quietly rather than openly, don't mention their Jude devotion to non-Catholic friends or colleagues. This privatization preserves the devotion but disconnects it from community, making it purely individual rather than communal practice. Others respond by translating Jude devotion into more universally accessible language. Rather than talking about a first-century apostle's supernatural intercession, they talk about hope, about not giving up, about finding strength in desperate times. Jude becomes a symbol of resilience rather than a literal supernatural agent. This makes the devotion more palatable to modern pluralistic sensibilities, but arguably empties it of its specifically Catholic content. If Jude is just a symbol of hope, why not use other symbols? What makes Jude specifically necessary? The fourth challenge comes from within Catholicism itself. The Second Vatican Council in the 1960s reformed Catholic liturgy and theology in ways that complicated traditional saint devotion. While the Council affirmed the veneration of saints, it also emphasized Christ as the sole mediator, warned against superstitious practices, and encouraged biblical and liturgical spirituality over popular devotions. Many progressive Catholics came to see elaborate saint devotions as pre-Vatican II leftovers, remnants of a magical thinking Catholicism that needed to be left behind. Jude devotion has sometimes been caught in these internal Catholic tensions. Progressive parishes might discourage it as unsophisticated, preferring more intellectually respectable liturgical prayer or social justice activism. Conservative parishes embrace it as part of traditional Catholic piety, proof of continuing connection to older forms of faith. Jude becomes a marker of ecclesiastical politics, his devotees stereotyped as either simple traditionalists clinging to superstition or as faithful conservatives preserving authentic Catholicism against modernist corruption. Yet despite these challenges, Jude devotion continues to thrive. The Chicago Shrine still receives hundreds of thousands of visitors. The online Jude presence has exploded, with countless websites offering Jude prayers, sharing testimonies, coordinating novenas. Social media is full of Jude devotees sharing their desperations and their reported miracles. Apps exist for praying the Jude novena, for tracking your 9 days, for setting prayer reminders. Jude has successfully translated into the digital age. This digital translation raises interesting questions about how virtual practice relates to embodied traditional practice. Does praying a Jude novena on an app have the same spiritual effect as praying it in a church? Does posting a testimony on Facebook fulfill the same promise as publishing a thank you in a newspaper? Does an online Jude community provide the same support as a physical shrine community? These questions don't have obvious answers, but they reveal how religious practice must continually adapt to technological and social change. The contemporary meanings of Jude have also evolved. While he remains primarily the patron of impossible causes, different populations emphasize different aspects. In Latino communities, Saint Jude Thaddeus has become associated with marginalized youth, with those in gangs or criminal activity seeking a way out, with migrants facing impossible journeys and immigration systems. In these contexts, Jude represents second chances, represents God's care for those society has abandoned, represents hope for redemption no matter how far you've fallen. In medical contexts, Jude is invoked particularly for terminal diagnoses, for situations where doctors have said there's nothing more they can do. Saint Jude Children's Research Hospital has made this association particularly strong. Jude is the saint for children with cancer, for families facing every parent's worst nightmare, for hoping against medical prognosis. The hospital's success in treating childhood cancers has created powerful testimonies linking Jude with pediatric healing, reinforcing this specific aspect of his patronage. In economic contexts, during recessions, and in areas of persistent poverty, Jude is the saint of the unemployed, of those facing foreclosure, of crushing debt and financial impossibility. His devotion spikes during economic crises as more people find themselves in desperate financial situations. The promises many make, that they'll publicize Jude's help if they find work, fill newspapers' classified sections with thank you notices that map economic desperation geography. In legal contexts, Jude is invoked by those facing criminal charges, deportation, custody battles, lawsuits they cannot afford to defend. The legal system's complexity and cost create many situations that feel impossible to navigate, where the power imbalance between individual and institution seems insurmountable. Jude becomes the advocate for those who cannot afford advocates, the lawyer for those facing legal impossibilities. But perhaps Jude's most profound contemporary meaning is existential rather than circumstantial. Beyond the specific desperate situations, medical, financial, legal, relational, there's a deeper desperation that characterizes modern experience. The sense of meaninglessness, of alienation, of isolation, of cosmic insignificance. In a secular age where traditional sources of meaning have eroded, where community has fragmented, where identity has become fluid and uncertain, where cosmic purpose seems like comforting fiction, many people face a kind of existential desperation that previous ages didn't experience in the same way. For some contemporary devotees, Jude becomes the saint not just of impossible external circumstances, but of impossible internal states. The impossibility of believing in a meaningful universe, the impossibility of sustaining hope in a world of climate catastrophe and nuclear weapons, the impossibility of finding purpose in an apparently purposeless cosmos, the impossibility of connection in an age of profound loneliness. Praying to Jude becomes a way of asserting that meaning exists even when you can't see it. That connection is possible even when you feel isolated. That hope has a foundation even when everything seems hopeless. This existential dimension of Jude devotion is rarely articulated explicitly, but runs through many contemporary testimonies. People report that Jude helped them not just by changing their circumstances, but by giving them strength to endure, perspective to accept, grace to survive. The miracle wasn't external rescue, but internal transformation. The impossible situation remained impossible, but they found it was possible to continue living, possible to maintain faith, possible to hope anyway. And Jude was the companion who made that possible endurance possible. This evolution of Jude's meaning shows how religious symbols adapt to meet changing human needs. The historical Jude, whatever he actually did or believed, becomes less important than what believers need Jude to be. He becomes a projection screen for human desperation across centuries and cultures, each age and community finding in him the patron who understands their particular form of impossibility. The forgotten apostle's very blankness, his lack of a detailed historical profile, makes him infinitely adaptable, able to be all things to all desperate people. Part 9. The Problem of Jude. theological and ethical questions. Saint Jude devotion raises troubling questions that honest theological reflection cannot avoid. Is this pious practice or superstition? Does it represent authentic Christianity or a corruption of it? Does it help people or harm them? These questions admit no easy answers, but avoiding them would mean failing to take Jude devotion seriously as a religious and social phenomenon deserving critical examination. The most fundamental question concerns the nature of God's relationship with the world. Traditional Catholic theology, drawing on Aquinas, holds that God is immutable and impassible, unchanging and unaffected by creatures. God's will is eternal, established before creation, not subject to influence or alteration. But petitionary prayer seems to assume that prayer can change God's will, that asking for something makes God more likely to grant it, that human petition affects divine action. If this is true, God is mutable and passible, changing in response to creature prayers. If it's not true, prayer is theatrical, going through motions that don't actually accomplish anything. Jude devotion intensifies this problem. It suggests not just that prayer matters, but that specific prayers to specific saints matter differentially. Praying to Jude for impossible cases is supposedly more effective than praying to other saints or directly to God for the same things. But why? Does Jude have special influence with God? That seems to make God play favorites. Does he have special expertise in impossible cases? That seems to limit God's sovereignty, as if God needed a specialist consultant for certain types of problems. Does he have a particular charism for desperate situations? But charisms are gifts of the Holy Spirit for ministry in this life. What does charism mean for disembodied souls in heaven? Some theologians try to resolve this by arguing that prayers to different saints don't actually work differently. They all ultimately go to God through Christ. The difference is psychological and spiritual on the human side, not metaphysical on the divine side. Praying to Jude helps you because you believe he understands your desperation, because his story resonates with your situation, because the ritual practice disciplines your hope. The specific saint you pray to shapes your prayer experience but doesn't affect God's response. This explanation preserves divine immutability but seems to reduce saint devotion to psychological therapy with religious trappings. If the saint doesn't actually do anything, if the mechanism is purely psychological, then why maintain the fiction? Why not honestly teach people that they're engaging in practices that help them psychologically but make no metaphysical difference? The answer seems to be that the psychological benefits depend on believing it's metaphysically real. It works only if you believe the saint actually intercedes, which means enlightenment about the psychological mechanism would destroy its effectiveness. The problem of unanswered prayer creates even deeper theological difficulties. When someone prays desperately to Saint Jude for a dying child's healing, and the child dies anyway, what does this mean? The standard theological responses are deeply unsatisfying to those experiencing the loss. God answered, but the answer was no. Sounds like cruel mockery to parents burying their child. God's ways are mysterious. Sounds like an admission that there's no real answer. Your loved one is in a better place is no comfort to those desperate for the person to remain in this place. The problem is sharpened by Jude's specific patronage. If he's the patron of impossible cases, if people specifically turn to him when all other hope is gone, then his apparent failure hits harder than generic unanswered prayer. You didn't just pray. You prayed to the designated specialist in desperate situations. You didn't just hope. You made a novena, wore the medal, lit the candles, promised to publicize his help. You did everything right according to the devotional logic. And still, nothing changed. The impossibility remained impossible. The desperate situation remained desperate. At this point, devotees face several options, all of them painful. They can conclude they weren't worthy, that their sins prevented the miracle, that God punished their inadequate faith. This preserves Jude's power and God's justice, but at devastating psychological cost, adding guilt and shame to grief, making people feel responsible for tragedies they didn't cause. They can conclude that God has different plans, that the apparent disaster is actually part of a larger good they can't yet see, that suffering serves mysterious purposes. This preserves faith, but requires heroic trust, and often feels like rationalization. They can conclude it wasn't God's will, that the person should have died, or the situation should have failed, that their desperate hope was inappropriate attachment to their own will rather than submission to divine will. This is theologically sophisticated, but emotionally brutal. You're supposed to accept that what you most desperately wanted was wrong to want. Or they can conclude that Jude devotion doesn't actually work, that it's superstition, that the testimonies of miracles are exaggerations or coincidences or lies, that there's no supernatural intercession happening. This preserves intellectual honesty, but means abandoning a practice that previously provided comfort and hope, and often means abandoning Catholic faith more broadly, as these doubts spread from one devotional practice to foundational beliefs. None of these options is remotely satisfying. Each involves either theological contortions, psychological damage, or loss of faith. The problem of unanswered prayer to the patron of impossible causes is, in other words, itself an impossible case. Impossible to resolve in ways that preserve both faith and honesty, both trust in God and acknowledgement of tragedy, both devotional practice and theological integrity. The ethical questions Jude devotion raises are equally difficult. Does it help people or harm them? The obvious answer is both. It helps some and harms others, or helps and harms the same people in different ways. But we should examine this more carefully. The potential benefits are real and significant. Comfort in suffering, hope in desperation, community among the isolated, structure in chaos, sense of agency when powerless, connection to the transcendent. These are genuine human goods, and if Jude devotion provides them, that's not nothing. But the potential harms are also real. Jude devotion can become a substitute for necessary action. Rather than seeking medical treatment, people might rely on prayers alone. Rather than addressing the systemic causes of their desperate situation, they might seek miraculous individual rescue. Rather than organizing collectively for change, they might pray individually for exemption. Devotion becomes passivity. Supernatural hope replaces natural responsibility. Jude devotion can also enable denial. The impossibility of the situation might be reality trying to tell you something important, that this relationship is unhealthy and needs to end, that this job is wrong for you, that this plan is misguided, that acceptance is wiser than continued fighting. By framing every desperate situation as potentially reversible through supernatural intervention, Jude devotion can delay necessary acceptance, prolong suffering, prevent people from moving forward, when moving forward is the healthiest response. The financial dimension is also troubling. While most Jude devotion is free or low cost, there are commercial elements. Candles must be purchased, medals and holy cards sold, pilgrimage expenses incurred, donations solicited. When people are desperate, they're vulnerable to exploitation. How much do some people spend on religious goods and practices that provide no benefit beyond placebo? How much of shrine donations come from people who can barely afford them, sacrificing material necessities for spiritual hopes? The economics of saint devotion can become predatory, extracting resources from vulnerable people by offering supernatural solutions to problems that have natural causes and natural solutions. There's also a question of false advertising. Calling Jude the patron of impossible cases sets expectations. People come to him expecting miracles, expecting their impossible situations to become possible. When this doesn't happen, as it often doesn't, they experience not just the original tragedy, but the added disappointment of failed religious hope. Would they be better off if they'd never developed expectations of supernatural rescue? Would they have adjusted to reality more quickly, grieved more healthily, moved forward more successfully? Yet these critiques can themselves be criticized as privileged and presumptuous. They typically come from people not currently in desperate situations, people with enough security to be skeptical about supernatural hope, people with enough resources to solve problems through natural means. For someone truly desperate, terminal diagnosis, crushing poverty, imminent violence, total isolation, the question, does this really work, might be less important than, does this help me get through today? If Jude devotion provides enough hope to keep going, enough structure to maintain sanity, enough sense of not aloneness to prevent despair, then maybe it doesn't matter whether the mechanism is supernatural intercession or psychological placebo. The deepest ethical question might be, do we have the right to take away people's hope, even if we believe that hope is based on fiction? Should skeptics expose what they see as the superstitious mechanics of saint devotion, even if doing so would destroy the benefits desperate people derive from it? Or should they remain silent, allowing people to maintain beliefs that might be false but are nonetheless helpful? This is a version of the noble lie question. Is it ethical to let people believe comforting falsehoods if truth would cause harm? Different philosophical and religious traditions answer differently. Some insist on truth, regardless of consequences. People have a right to truth, even when truth is painful. And beliefs based on falsehood are corrupt, even if psychologically beneficial. Others prioritize compassion over truth. Causing suffering by destroying hope requires stronger justification than allowing false but comforting beliefs to persist. Religious believers often argue that skeptics who think they're exposing falsehoods are themselves wrong. What looks like psychological mechanism might be how God works. What skeptics call placebo might be grace. What appears to be projection might be genuine spiritual reality. The problem has no resolution because it depends on metaphysical claims that cannot be definitively proven or disproven. Either supernatural intercession is real or it isn't. Either saints can hear prayers and influence divine action, or they can't. Either miracles attributed to Jude result from his intercession, or they result from natural causes and coincidences being interpreted through religious frameworks. We cannot run controlled experiments on the efficacy of prayer. We cannot access an alternate timeline where someone didn't pray to see whether the outcome would have been different. We cannot open heaven and observe whether Jude is actually doing what believers claim he does. This epistemological uncertainty means that Jude devotion, like all religious practice, operates in a space where faith and doubt, hope and skepticism, benefit and harm, truth and fiction all coexist impossibly. It is itself a desperate situation without clear resolution, an impossible case that requires choosing to proceed despite uncertainty. And perhaps that makes it appropriate that Jude's devotion involves these impossible questions. The saint of impossible situations is himself surrounded by impossible theological and ethical problems that defy satisfying solutions. Part 10. The Legacy of the Forgotten Apostle. What finally does Saint Jude's story mean? What does his journey from obscure first-century apostle to forgotten saint to beloved intercessor for impossible cases tell us about Christianity, about humanity, about how desperate people seek hope across 2,000 years? The first lesson is about historical contingency. Jude's current prominence as patron of impossible causes was not inevitable. It depended on specific historical circumstances, the name problem that kept him obscure for centuries, the Counter-Reformation's emphasis on saint devotion, the marketing savvy of 20th century religious orders, the desperate needs of Depression-era and later populations. A different set of circumstances might have left him permanently forgotten, or might have given him a completely different patronage. There's nothing inherent in who Jude was that necessitated his current role. This contingency might trouble believers who want to see divine providence orchestrating everything. But it might also reveal how providence actually works, not through predetermined scripts, but through the intersection of human need, cultural development, institutional interest, and spiritual yearning. Perhaps God works through historical accident and human marketing just as much as through miraculous signs and direct revelations. Perhaps the fact that Jude became available when desperately needed was itself a kind of providence, even if the mechanism involved very human processes. The second lesson concerns the power of obscurity and hiddenness. Jude's lack of a detailed biblical profile, his centuries of being forgotten, his absence from the attention of most Christians, this very obscurity became his greatest asset once devotion to him developed. Because nothing was fixed about who he was or what he did, he could become whatever desperate people needed him to be. The blank slate of his biography became the canvas for human hopes and needs across cultures and centuries. This suggests something important about religious symbols and figures. The most specific and well-defined ones have limited applicability. They're powerful for particular purposes, but can't be universally adapted. The more vague and undefined ones can be infinitely reinterpreted, can mean many things to many people, can evolve with changing needs. Jude's power as a religious figure derives paradoxically from his weakness as a historical personality. We know so little about him that we can project almost anything onto him. The third lesson involves the persistence of hope against impossibility. The fact that millions of people continue to pray to Saint Jude about situations they acknowledge are impossible reveals something profound about human nature. We cannot simply accept impossibility. Even when reason says there's no hope, even when evidence argues for despair, even when experts confirm that the situation is beyond salvaging, we continue to hope. We seek grounds for hope anywhere we can find them, in saints, in prayers, in rituals, in stories of past miracles, in testimonies of others whose impossible situation somehow resolved. This persistence of hope might be delusion, refusing to accept reality, engaging in magical thinking that prevents realistic adjustment to circumstances. Or it might be the deepest wisdom, recognizing that reality is more than the visible and calculable, that reason and evidence don't exhaust truth, that the impossible sometimes becomes possible in ways we cannot predict or explain. Religious traditions generally affirm the latter, secular traditions the former, and individuals struggling with desperate situations oscillate between both perspectives. The fourth lesson concerns the relationship between individual and community in religious practice. Jude devotion is intensely personal. Each devotee brings their own desperate situation, prays for their own particular need, seeks their own individual miracle. But it's also profoundly communal, practiced within churches and shrines, structured by common prayers and rituals, sustained by shared testimonies and collective belief. The individual desperation connects you to countless others facing similar desperation, creating solidarity among the desperate. This communal dimension of individual practice is often overlooked, but crucial. When you light a candle to Saint Jude at a shrine, you see dozens or hundreds of other candles lit by others. When you pray the Jude Novena, you know thousands of others are praying the same prayer. When you read testimonies, you recognize your own situation in others' stories. This creates a community of suffering and hope, a fellowship of the desperate that itself provides comfort beyond whatever supernatural intercession might occur. You are not alone in your impossible situation. Others have faced similar impossibilities. Some report that their situations improved, and all continue to hope despite uncertainty. The fifth lesson addresses how religious meaning develops over time. Jude's story shows that saints are not static figures with fixed meanings established at death. They evolve, develop new associations, gain new patronages, mean different things to different communities and eras. This evolution is sometimes directed by church authorities, but more often emerges organically from popular devotion. People assign meanings to saints based on their own needs and experiences. The church may later officially recognize these assignments, but the development happens from the bottom up, not top down. This means that saints are, in a sense, collaborative creations between the historical person, church tradition, and popular imagination. The historical Jude contributed his apostleship, his martyrdom, his obscurity. Church tradition preserved his name, his place in the apostolic college, his basic story. Popular imagination assigned him his specific patronage, developed his devotional practices, created the testimonies and rituals that define his cult. All three elements are necessary. None alone is sufficient. The sixth lesson concerns the problem of suffering and the varieties of religious response to it. Different religious traditions handle suffering very differently. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from attachment and craving. The solution is letting go. Stoicism teaches that suffering comes from expecting what we cannot control. The solution is accepting fate. Christianity teaches that suffering is mysteriously permitted by a good God for reasons we don't fully understand, but that God suffers with us and will ultimately redeem all suffering. Within Christianity, different emphases produce different practices. Some stress acceptance, others stress petition, others stress solidarity with the suffering Christ. Jude devotion represents a particular approach, actively seeking supernatural intervention to end suffering rather than passively accepting it. It says, "I will not simply submit to this desperate situation. I will petition for divine rescue." This is neither better nor worse than other approaches, just different. It reflects a particular understanding of God's relationship with creation, of prayer's purpose, of human agency versus divine sovereignty. For some people, in some situations, this approach provides what they need. For others, or in other circumstances, different approaches work better. The seventh lesson involves the mystery of prayer and its effects. Does praying to Saint Jude produce different outcomes than not praying? The evidence is unclear and contested. Believers report miracles and attribute them to Jude's intercession. Skeptics see coincidences and natural explanations being interpreted through religious frameworks. Studies of intercessory prayer have produced conflicting results and are probably methodologically impossible to do well. The question may be unanswerable, but perhaps the more important question is, does prayer change the person praying? Here, the evidence is clearer. Prayer practices shape consciousness, direct attention, structure emotion, create meaning, connect individuals to communities and traditions. Praying to Saint Jude in desperate situations focuses the mind on hope rather than despair, on petition rather than passivity, on connection rather than isolation. Whether or not external circumstances change, internal experience changes. Whether that internal change is valuable enough to justify the practice depends on one's values and beliefs. The eighth lesson concerns the modern viability of ancient religious practices. In a scientific secular age where fewer people accept supernatural metaphysics, where religious authority has declined, where institutional religion is increasingly optional, can practices like saint devotion continue? The answer appears to be yes, though transformed. People continue to pray to Saint Jude, but often with more psychological and less metaphysical understanding. They might not literally believe that Jude's disembodied soul hears their prayers and lobbies God on their behalf, but they find the practice of invoking him helpful, meaningful, comforting. The ritual works even when the metaphysics becomes uncertain. This suggests that religious practices can survive the decline of the belief systems that originally generated them, at least for a time. They persist through cultural momentum, through emotional satisfaction, through social bonding, through lack of compelling alternatives. Whether this represents genuine religious evolution or death by secularization is debatable and perhaps unanswerable. But it means that even skeptics can appreciate what Jude devotion provides to desperate people, even if they don't share believers' explanations for why it provides it. The ninth lesson addresses identity and self-understanding. For many devotees, being someone who prays to Saint Jude becomes part of their identity. They are a Jude person, someone under his special patronage, someone with a particular relationship to this particular saint. This identity connects them to a tradition, gives them a spiritual narrative, provides a framework for understanding their struggles and their hopes. The identity is both individual, my personal relationship with Saint Jude, and collective, belonging to the community of Jude devotees. It's both ancient, connecting to first-century apostolic Christianity, and contemporary, addressing 21st-century desperate situations. This identity formation, through religious devotion, shows how religion functions not just as belief system, but as life orientation. not just as intellectual commitment, but as existential grounding. Being a Jude devotee means seeing your desperate situations as opportunities for faith rather than as occasions for despair, means interpreting your life through a narrative of divine care and saintly intercession, means locating yourself within a vast community of the suffering and the hoping that spans centuries and continents. The 10th and final lesson is about the enduring human need for mediation. One of the puzzles about saint devotion for Protestants and secularists is why people don't just go directly to God. If God is all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly loving, why do you need saints as intermediaries? Why complicate the relationship with additional layers? The answer is that direct relationship with infinite transcendent deity is psychologically overwhelming. God as abstract, infinite perfection is difficult to relate to personally. Saints provide relatable human faces, understandable human stories, accessible human concerns. They mediate the overwhelming divine presence in ways humans can handle. Jude specifically provides mediation for desperation. When you're desperate, approaching God directly can be intimidating. Who am I to bother the creator of the universe with my small, desperate problem? But approaching Jude feels more manageable. He was human like me. He faced difficulties. He understands desperation. He's designated to handle cases like mine. The saint makes the divine accessible, makes prayer psychologically possible when direct approach to God feels impossible. Whether this is theologically necessary or just psychologically helpful is debatable, but its practical value is clear. 2,000 years after his death, Jude Thaddeus remains present in the lives of millions. He has gone from obscure apostle to forgotten saint to beloved intercessor, from barely known to desperately needed, from historical figure to living spiritual reality. Whether you see this as genuine supernatural presence or as religious imagination creating what humans need, whether you believe in his intercession or see it as psychological projection, whether you pray to him or dismiss the practice as superstition, none of this changes the fact that he matters intensely to those facing impossible situations. The forgotten apostle became the saint who remembers the forgotten. The one whose story was lost became the one who hears stories of desperate loss. The one nobody invoked became the one everyone invokes when there's nowhere else to turn. This transformation, improbable and circuitous, driven by accident as much as intention, might itself be the greatest miracle attributed to Saint Jude. Not healing diseases or solving financial crises or preventing disasters, but becoming present for those who need presence, becoming hope for those beyond hope, becoming companionship for those facing impossibility alone. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question of whether Jude's intercession works supernaturally misses the point. Perhaps what matters is that millions of desperate people, faced with situations they cannot solve and circumstances they cannot change, find in Saint Jude something that helps them continue, hope to sustain them, prayers to structure them, community to support them, narrative to make sense of their suffering, companionship to make bearable the unbearable. Whether that something comes from heaven through saintly intercession or emerges from human hearts through religious practice, it is real in its effects. It preserves people through their desperate hours. And for those in desperate hours, that preservation is itself miraculous, itself impossible, itself worthy of gratitude to whatever saint or symbol or source makes it possible. The story of Saint Jude Thaddeus, from obscure apostle to patron of impossible causes, is ultimately a story about human desperation and human hope, about how we face the impossible and refuse to surrender to it, about how we find resources for continuing when every rational reason says we should quit. It's a story that will continue as long as humans face desperate situations, which is to say, forever. And so Saint Jude, the forgotten apostle, will be remembered. The saint nobody knew will continue to be invoked by millions who desperately need someone to know them, to hear them, to stand with them in their impossible moments. The least of the apostles has become the greatest friend of those who feel themselves least, forgotten, impossible. And that reversal, from last to first, from forgotten to remembered, from impossible to possible, that's the miracle at the heart of the entire Jude story.